House of Commons Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development. Pursuant to the motion adopted by the committee on Tuesday, January 27th, 2026, the committee to study the subject matter of clauses 460 to 462, Division 27 of Bill C-15, an act to implement certain provisions of the budget tabled in Parliament on November 4th, 2025. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders. Members are attending in person in the room and can also attend remotely using the Zoom application. I would now like to welcome our witnesses for the first hour. The Honorable Anita Anand, Minister of Foreign Affairs, welcome. From the Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development, Robert Brookfield, Director General, Sanctions and Strategic Export Controls. Joya Donnelly, Director General, Northeast Asia Bureau. Jason Latour, Director General, North American Bureau. And Stephanie McCollum, Director General, Middle East. Up to 5 minutes will be given for opening remarks, after which we will proceed with rounds of questions. I now invite Minister Anand to make an opening statement. Bienvenue.
Monsieur le Président, Mesdames,
Chair, ladies and gentlemen, committee members.
Here before you today regarding limited amendments to the Export and Import Permits Act as part of Bill C-15. We have heard how fast global disruptions can move, and Canada needs the tools to be able to act quickly. These two succinct amendments to the EIPA would give the government new tools to protect the economy and to ensure that we are protected from supply chain shocks that could harm Canadian jobs, supply chains, and access to essential goods. Namely, they would grant the government the ability to act in cases of economic coercion. I want to emphasize that these items would not create new controls. They wouldn't remove oversight or consultation. They'd simply create a new statutory authority to develop controls in the future, and a future that Canada will increasingly need in order to defend and protect our economic sovereignty. Before providing context regarding Canada's new foreign policy approach, I will address two particular issues on which Canada is currently engaged. First, Canada stands with the people of Iran as they exercise their right to protest against the brutality of the Iranian regime. Iran's brutal repression against its own people must end. Thousands of people have been injured or killed by the regime, including at least one Canadian. Canada listed the IRGC as a terrorist entity more than 18 months ago, and last week the European Union did the same. I can also tell you today that in addition to the almost 500 sanctions that we have imposed against entities and individuals, we are continuing to work on this important issue. And in particular, I am working to impose additional sanctions against the Iranian entities and individuals for violations of international peace and security and human rights violations. J'aimerais aussi parler de la situation en
I would also like to address the situation in Haiti. Canada condemns any action that would further destabilize Haiti and undermine the security of the Haitian people. I continue to call on all members of the Presidential Transitional Council to respect the agreed end of their mandate, February 7th, as well as the Haitian people's right to free and fair elections. I will have measures ready to implement if members of the Transitional Council do not respect their commitment and the rights of the Haitian people.
The world as it is, not the world as we wish it to be, and adapt our diplomacy and our foreign policy accordingly. And our approach is guided by three pillars. First, building a strong and resilient domestic economy with the goal of doubling non-U.S. trade over the next decade. Second, protecting Canadian sovereignty, including through strategic investments and partnerships in defense and security. Third, upholding our principles and our values, including international law and international humanitarian law. From Ukraine to Greenland to Iran and beyond, Canada stands for international law and international human rights. These three objectives are not mutually exclusive. That is to say that none is more important than the others. We pursue them together. That is why our foreign policy is best described as principled pragmatism. L'engagement international ne signifie pas la...
International engagement does not mean agreeing on everything. It means a willingness to work together, even in the face of disagreement. Canada remains firmly committed to human rights, democracy, inclusion, including gender equality, and the rule of law. These values guide how we choose to engage and the issues on which we do so.
The false binary that if we cannot agree on everything internationally, we cannot agree on anything. Engagement doesn't always mean agreement. We're not forced to choose between advancing our economic and our security interests and upholding our values. This is principled pragmatism, and this is Canada's foreign policy in 2026. I will end by saying that a strong domestic economy expands the list of things that Canada has, and indeed, these are things that the world wide wants. It attracts investments, strengthens resilience, and it gives us leverage to have a strong domestic economy. Stronger at home means stronger abroad. The ability to resist economic coercion. It means we are better able to negotiate from a position of strength. The amendments we are discussing today will add to Canada's robust toolkit, providing an extra layer of security. Prosperity, too, is a choice. It is built patiently and deliberately by societies that invest in resilience, openness, and their place in the world. That is the choice that Canada is making, and one that we will continue to make at home and abroad with partners around the world. Mr. Chair, it is in this global context that our new government is putting forward the limited amendments to the Export and Import Permits Act, and I look forward to responding to questions from members on these measures. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister, for your remarks. I will now open the floor for questions, beginning with MP Ziad Abultaif. You have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Minister, for appearing with your team to the committee and recognizing the protesters in Iran and the freedom of the Iranian people is the right thing to do, the least we can do as a country in support of their call for freedom and for finishing the dictatorship regime that they've been experiencing for decades. Minister, you call the new measures a protocol or a new protocol measure, but you felt somehow that was economic security designation is needed to the export and import control list. Why those economic security measures are needed, and how do you anticipate to being used?
Merci pour la question. Peut-être je pourrais commencer.
Thank you for the question. I might begin by saying that these powers could make it possible to respond quickly to foreign acts that might be damaging to security. It is yet one more tool to respond to economic issues on the international scene. The bill does not immediately create new controls. What it does is provide authority to formulate them in the future. It is designed to protect jobs, supply chains, and to respond to economic coercion. It provides another level and one more tool, enabling us to respond to threats from outside Canada.
You never answered my question. Now, how do you anticipate the new measures being used?
The work that we are doing now is to provide the protections in the future. And I will say that these authorities would be used only if necessary and on a case-by-case basis. The tools that we are proposing would enable monitoring, limiting, directing, or collecting information on imports and on exports. Any action does require a cost-benefit analysis, and we will be examining all risks before utilizing these tools. I will say that global disruptions occur quickly, and Canada needs tools to be able to act just as quickly. These amendments provide the government with these tools to protect our economy from foreign actions and supply chain shocks that could harm Canadian jobs, supply chains, and access to essential goods. It's responsible for us to be putting in place these measures. We very much hope that the opposition will support us in these measures.
Minister, there must be something happen that you came up with these provisions. And if you can be specific on which industry do you think begging the most question, and why do we need to do or to come up with these measures?
The key point I want to make in response to this question is that it would be imprudent to speculate on all the wide-ranging hypothetical possibilities that could be presented to us in the future in a rapidly shifting and dynamic global environment. The work that we are doing now is to lay the foundation in providing the government with tools should the need arise. We are always engaged in scenario planning, and this is a constant activity undertaken by my officials, including those here with us today. It would be imprudent for me to speculate on particular hypotheticals, but this is very much about protecting our economic security, and I know that my colleagues on both sides of the aisle in the House of Commons care about the future of our country and the economic security with which we are protecting supply chains.
I'm not questioning the measure. You're talking about hypothetical scenarios, but there must be a fundamental reason why we're doing this to any specific industry that I would like to hear your answer on that. I think will be beneficial because there got to be a logic behind such an improvement on the current system. If you call it an improvement, you're not calling it a new protocol. So it would be nice to share with us those fundamentals. I think would be great for the committee to hear that.
Say in answer to your question, to my honorable colleague's question, that all industries need to be protected in an uncertain global environment. We have seen the global trading system completely rewired. Therefore, we want the tools at our disposal to respond to the needs of all sectors of the economy should that need arise. And as I said, should the need arise, we will take a very careful risk-benefit analysis. We want to make sure we have the tools in our toolbox to protect the domestic economy, to cooperate with other countries, and to respond to systemic shocks should that arise.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We now next go to MP Mona Fortier. You have 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup et merci, Madame la Ministre, d'être avec nous.
Thank you, and thank you for being here today, Minister. This is a subject that's important to us because the exercise we're engaged in today will make it possible for us to go to the next stage and pass the budget. We know full well that the budget will make it possible for us to make further headway, and therefore today's exercise, how can I put it, is a study of the provisions in practical terms as requested of us by the Finance Committee. You could perhaps confirm that this provision had already been put forward in the economic statement a year ago, but it died on the order paper. So this is not the first time that the government is examining tools of this kind as being necessary instruments. We are continuing to see disruptions around the world. They are changing quickly, and Canada needs these tools so that it can act to be more flexible, to respond more quickly. We know that we're told there's a great deal of red tape, but we need to find instruments that will allow for greater flexibility. I think that is what you're proposing today. Could you please tell us more about these new powers? Why are they needed in addition to the controls we already have with the existing Export and Import Act? Why do we need these new powers? Thank you for the question. It's correct. This is not the first time we're considering measures of this kind. Second, I could add that Japan, Germany, the US, and the EU, among others, have passed economic security measures to protect against outside threats. So this is a responsible measure. It's responsible to have a provision of this kind so that we can respond to the systemic shock, the economic shocks, and to build the supply chains we need for industries in all of our economic sectors. That's clear. Moreover, the provisions proposed would broaden existing powers so that Canada would be better able to control some imports as well as some exports in response to measures taken abroad. As I said, pertaining to shocks, there might be moments where we cannot anticipate a given shock. And then what are we to do? We need to have legal measures affording us the possibility of responding with the capacity we need, capacity that our allies have already adopted. And that is why we're presenting these measures today. We hope that the opposition will support us in moving them forward. Yes, we're looking for support so we can move forward. Thank you for the answer. Twice in your opening remarks and again in your latest answer, you mentioned economic security. Could you tell us more what economic security means to the government? Of course. We need to understand that this is a very difficult time for the world economy. We have been witnessing unilateralism, greater protectionism, and what that means is that the international order is looking very different. So we have to be flexible with the tools we have and use. We need to have a variety of ways in which to respond, not just through diplomacy, not just through one minister. It is our entire government, our entire country, that has to stand together, work together, and make sure we have the measures we need. The Export and Import Permits Act and the changes we're proposing to it are limited. these changes are important and necessary to protect our economy. Thank you for explaining. I think it's important that people listening to us today and us understand the terms, and you described economic security well. Unfortunately, I'm out of time, but I'd like to thank you again for being here today and for the leadership that you are bringing to the issue. You talked about Haiti this week. This week marks a turning point for Haiti, and I hope we'll be working on Canada's position vis-à-vis Haiti.
Very much. Next, we go to Monsieur Duceppe. Vous avez 6 minutes.
Gilles Duceppe for 6 minutes. You spoke about a balance, how best to find a balance between protecting Canada's economic interests and supporting its responsibilities in the area of human rights and international security. I'd like to begin by reiterating the need to understand the 3 pillars underpinning our foreign affairs policy. Simultaneously, one pillar is not more important than another. We need to continue supporting our principles and values in international law as well as supporting our national economy. This is important, Chair, if I may. I'm sorry, I can't let the Minister conclude. I'm not talking about pillars or the government's vision. I'm talking about the articles, the provisions of the bill that are going to be amended, and what will the impact be with regard to the economy and forced labor. Yes, that question is somewhat different than it was initially. You're quite right. The measures are limited. And that means we need to have the tools we need to respond to economic shocks. And these controls can be used to secure supply chains or to respond to economic coercion. What we need is to protect Canada against economic threats. That's clear. And that's why there is an isolated and limited provision in this that is very necessary to protect our domestic economy, our national economy, and I hope everyone's on the same page. A very easy question that will not require a long answer. If I understand correctly, these provisions have no impact on supply chains that rely on forced labor.
Comme j'ai dit ici,
as I said the last time I appeared before you, as a government, we believe in human rights, in international law, and in the rights of workers. That's clear. It's not a complicated question, Minister. You have appeared before the committee. I'm putting my questions very politely, and they're very precise. I'm asking you about forced labor. So is the answer no? These provisions will have no impact on supply chains that use forced labor. The deal you made with China recently, and it involves tens of thousands of electric vehicles. It is documented, and I can provide you with the studies. The larger steel and aluminium producers in the world were encouraged by the Chinese government to settle in Xinjiang, where the minority population is being coerced into forced labor. That is why the cars are so cheap. What's your response? Are we bringing into Canada products that have forced labor built into the supply chain. Is that what you're saying, Minister?
Je voudrais être clair que
I would like to be clear. Forced labor is unacceptable, and it's wrong to say that this is an agreement or a contract. It is a resolution of some friction in the bilateral relationship between Canada and China. That's clear. We're not talking about free trade between the two countries, and Canada will always support the fact that forced labor is unacceptable. Well, if it's unacceptable, why let 49,000 Chinese vehicles in? Because those supply chains are using parts built with forced labor. If China conducts a military operation against Taiwan, will the deal on Chinese electric vehicles still hold? And if this is too hypothetical, I would remind you that you've been using the word hypothetical about situations that might hypothetically occur in the future. I would like to stress two things. First of all, I have always said that public safety and human rights are principles that are important in our foreign affairs. And second, we don't have a bilateral agreement with China as such. It is a means to resolve some tensions in our bilateral relationship. So, as I said, we will continue with our three pillars. So these Chinese vehicles don't exist. So it's not an agreement.
Of questions, starting with MP Kramp-Nyman. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Minister, for being here today. I'd like to focus most of my comments or most of my questions on Division 27 of Bill C-15. As you're aware, it's designed to protect Canada's economic sovereignty or economic security. Recently, in front of the Senate Foreign Affairs and International Trade Committee, Ms. Galadza stated that economic security is a broad term. In this context, it includes Canada's ability to manage foreign threats and shocks while guiding economic security such as imports and exports to support national security objectives and to foster growth. My first question, Minister, is are there any oversight mechanisms in place to assure any concerns regarding potential overreach or misapplication of these new powers?
This is a minor amendment to the Export and Import Permits Act, simply to ensure that the supply and distribution of the good in Canada or internationally are consistent with Canada's economic security interests. And so the power, if adopted, would be used only in limited circumstances and in circumstances after a risk-benefit analysis was undertaken upon careful and systematic consideration by my department. I have my official here, and he can speak to that, Mr. Brookfield.
So just to elaborate briefly on the process, the idea would be if this amendment passes, it would be an ability to add a regulation that would add a particular product described either by Harmonized System Code or some other method, and then it would be illegal to export or import that item without a permit. That permit could be granted automatically, for example, as is presently the case for softwood lumber, or be granted on certain conditions, such as further to an agreement with other countries or in order to support Canada's defence and to support our own industries.
And how would this new authority differ from the Governor and Council's existing authorities under the Act?
This particular limited provision makes it explicit that there is an ability in cases where the government needs to address economic security that it can act. It's a new legal distinction, and we believe that in this time of economic stress in the global economy, that it is necessary to provide government with this additional tool.
Thank you. My next question, does the government have a hard definition of foreign threats and shocks? And the reason I ask that is I'm curious if the Canadian government considers the Chinese government's documented interference in previous Canadian elections a foreign threat.
The work of Madam Justice Og in the Og inquiry was extremely important for analyzing different types of concerns relating to foreign interference. And we are responding to the recommendations in that report. In every engagement I have internationally, I speak of the importance of public safety and security, of the domestic situation in Canada, and I will continue to do that. National security is already a rationale in terms of this particular limited amendment, and we are simply asking to add the words economic security, which would then go through the regulatory process.
And my last two questions, does the domestic human rights record of foreign states factor into that consideration you just spoke of? And lastly, would the dumping of steel into Canada by nations such as China constitute an economic threat?
I want to reiterate that in my discussions with my counterparts, I always underline the importance of human rights, international law, and the domestic public safety and security. This is without exception. And in addition, I will say that we work with other countries. Indeed, as many examples from our chair of the G7 showed, in order to show consistent positions on human rights, and that those rights apply across the board. Engagement with countries does not mean endorsement. We raise these issues along with a host of other issues because we take them seriously. We have to be able to be at the table, to have the strength of our convictions to raise points of disagreement without destabilizing areas of cooperation.
Thank you very much. We next go to MP Stephen Guilbeault. You have 5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Merci, Madame la Ministre, d'être ici. Vous me permettez.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for being here, Minister. I'd like to greet our former ambassador to Sweden. You said something at the beginning. You said the international system was becoming or was being rewired. For the less young of us in the room, it will remind us of Francis Fukuyama's book, The Last Line in the End of History. We thought democracy was really the apogee of political evolution, and it seems this is not so. We're seeing things we never thought we'd see again. This is why it's so important for the Canadian government to review some of our statutes and regulations and to see where we need to act or to respond. One question is this: how will the proposed provisions, which I hope will be supported by the opposition, how do those provisions and engagements harmonize with what other governments are doing and with our free trade agreements? First of all, thank you for the question and for recognizing that Francis Fukuyama's words are not the last word, as it were. He reiterated the significance of multilateral institutions in his book, The End of History and The Last Man. Multilateral institutions are very important, but we have a new reality to contend with, and that means we need to respond to the environment as it is, to economic conditions, and to the international situation. At present, the situation is difficult. But I see that many of my counterparts in other countries are responding with specific measures. They're cooperating with one another. They're working together within multilateral institutions. So economic security can be seen as an expression that encompasses Canada's ability to manage foreign threats and shocks. It is possible for us to be flexible. It is possible for us to respond to what's happening, but I hope that everyone in this room and in the chamber can work together as we did at the beginning of the pandemic, when everyone said that our country needs us to work together and our country needs us to cooperate, not to engage in partisan politics. I appreciate the question, but I do at the same time hope that we can work together for our country. Thank you, Minister. I know that some colleagues put a question that's similar to this one from me, but could you explain to the committee why the government believes it needs these changes? Why are our existing tools not sufficient to deal with the ever-shifting context?
Il est vrai que le Canada dispose.
It is true that Canada does have a strong toolkit to protect its economic security, including statutes and application mechanisms designed to protect natural resources. I want to thank you for your very hard work on this to protect intellectual property and promote business and deal with a wide range of economic coercion mechanisms. This will be yet another tool for us. We have existing mechanisms, but we need to be there to support our economy. We need the legal capacity to respond. As my honourable colleague said, there are processes in place. There are things we can do through orders in council, but we can add to the legislation a new mechanism.
Giuseppe, you have 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Duceppe, 2.5 minutes. You said, Minister, that you have not signed an agreement as such in China. You said you didn't sign an agreement in China, not an agreement as such. Point of order, Chair. I just want to see how that applies to the conversation we're having today. We're supposed to be looking at specific provisions. We're talking about commercial agreements, Chair, and agreements that affect supply chains and import and export.
Donc, j'espère que j'ai pas perdu de temps là-dessus. J'aimerais ça savoir.
I hope I didn't lose any time with that. You said that there was no agreement. I said that we needed to diversify our supply chains while at the same time resolving some of the tensions. Minister, I'm going to answer in your stead. We need to diversify supply chains and reduce tensions in our bilateral relationship. You know, it's unfortunate that you're basically laughing at my question. This is a total lack of respect for your part. In your question, and I will quote what the Prime Minister said on January 16, in order to renew the relationship, Prime Minister Carney and President Xi concluded a trade agreement. So there are the words trade agreement. So to me, that is a trade agreement that's been concluded. 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles are coming into Canada under this trade agreement, and we know full well that some of the parts in those vehicles come from supply chains with forced labor. Yet you're saying it's unacceptable to have forced labor, and yet you sign a trade agreement that will bring into Canada products issued from chains with forced labor. A trade agreement is a different subject of conversation. I'm talking about import. Chair, I understand that the member across the way is not necessarily receiving the answers he would like. That is no reason to say what he just did to the minister. I have my reasons, and you have yours. I will continue with what I was saying. I can come back to the article. How will the new provisions block imports of products that involve forced labor? How will the new provisions help us to block products involving forced labor from supply chains? Our foreign affairs policy includes measures to protect our values, our human rights values, while at the same time diversifying our supply chains. And we are continuing to make sure that we have policies that protect Canadian interests. We are continuing to stress the importance of human rights, and that's clear. And I hope everyone can understand that. We are a government that has the ability to move ahead with a variety of measures at the same time. Human rights, international law are things we care about. And for the sake of our country and citizens, we also need to build our national economy. And I hope everyone can see that.
Mantle, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Minister, in your opening statement and in many of your interventions, you spoke about upholding Canadian values here at home and abroad. Would you agree that includes things like free expression, association, protection from unreasonable search, etc.?
Again, I'm happy to allow at least some leeway for the first question, but let's please try to stick to the topic at hand, which is the Import-Export
Directly reference the minister's opening comments. If that's not relevant.
Hence, I'm saying the leeway for the first question. And please, if you want to test the chair's ability to cut you off, I'm happy to play that game. Thank you.
I am a lawyer and I believe in the law. These amendments are about economic security. This doesn't mean that we're not addressing issues relating to human rights and international law.
You've answered my question. I guess now that the Federal Court of Appeal has ruled that, in fact, your government trampled on those rights here at home.
I'm sorry. I
want to give you the opportunity to say if you would like to change your opinion.
I'm going to suspend the meeting. Let's suspend the meeting for 5 minutes so that we can get back in order. This is not a stage for us to veer into other. This is a very clear agreement between members. You weren't part of that meeting to discuss these amendments, and that's what I intend to make sure that we keep this meeting to. I'm happy to give you some leeway on your first question. I warned you about your second question. You veered way off, and so we'll come back in 5 minutes. Reminder to all members that the motion that was passed and that triggered this meeting is for this committee to focus on the subject matter of clauses 460 to 462, Division 27 of Bill C C-15, an act to implement certain provisions of the budget tabled in Parliament on November 4th, 2025. As I said in my previous comments, I'm happy to provide a little bit of leeway to members to get to their questions and build their arguments, but it has to be within these proposed amendments to the Export and Import Permit Act, which is Division 27 of Bill C-15. So we resume the line of questioning of the Minister by MP Mantle. You have
I might count at 4 minutes.
4 minutes, yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Minister, Canada has extensive sanctions and export controls on goods who would find their destination in Russia, correct? Under both the Special Economic Measures Act and the Export and Import Permits Act. Is that correct?
We have a comprehensive EIPA, as your question suggests, correct?
How many prosecutions have been undertaken with respect to violations of that sanctions regime under either the SEMA or the EIPA with respect to China, or sorry, with respect to Russia?
I will ask my officials to respond with the data. Thank you.
There's one case that I'm aware of, the Trofimov case, where RCP has laid charges against an individual for allegedly transferring joint parts, I believe it was, to Russia.
So that's one case. So we have a comprehensive regime targeting Russia, and we have had, in so many years of the war, we've had one case. So you've said that we have a comprehensive regime. You need to make this change to make it even stronger. Why should we believe anything will change, even making this amendment, when you're not prosecuting or enforcing the law as it is today?
With respect, the responsibility rests with the RCMP to conduct investigations and to make a determination as to whether a prospective violation has occurred. What I am here to defend today is the need for us to have an additional legislative tool relating to economic security. And so I raised that point, and I also raised
Thank
the
you, Minister.
point
You've
that
answered my question there. You take no responsibility for the enforcement of Canada's sanctions against Russia's war machine. I take you on that.
Point of order, Mr. Chair, that is not at all what the Minister just said.
She can make her comments, and I will make mine.
I agree with my honorable colleague that you are misrepresenting my comments, and I would ask with respect, as I am speaking truthfully, I would ask you to not misinterpret and misrepresent what I am saying.
What
Thank
other
you.
evidence do you have that you've been doing what you say? There's one prosecution. If there's more or there's other evidence you can provide the committee, feel free.
I would suggest that the Minister...
I think the Minister is capable to answer. She doesn't need your help.
No, I'm not helping anyone. I am being the chair of the committee, and I would ask you to
Mr.
please...
Chair, I'm happy to respond
Okay.
with the information that I have. But I was correct in my point that it is the RCMP that responds to violations of the sanctions regime. We've been clear that Russia must pay in the reconstruction of Ukraine. We introduced the sanctions-based private asset seizure and forfeiture regime in 2022. These authorities have been used in December 2022 to restrain U.S. $26 million believed to be owned or controlled by Roman Abramovich, and in June 2023 to seize an Antonov aircraft grounded at Pearson Airport believed to be owned or controlled by Volga Dnipro
Thank you, Minister. I just have
Airlines.
25
So
seconds
that's
left, so I want to get one more
that's
question.
some
He
evidence
wanted example.
of
Now that
what
he's getting
I'm
example,
doing.
he's not
Those
happy.
are
Like,
examples.
he has to pick a lane at some point.
And that plane
Chair.
sits on the tarmac as we stand here today. Last-
Actually, I am making a claim in Ontario Superior Court for us to have legal right to seize and liquidate that asset if necessary. So again, another example
Will you
of the
prohibit
way in which I'm
Russian
acting,
refined
Mr.
petroleum
Chair.
products from entering Canada under the EIPA? Will you prohibit Russian refined petroleum products from entering Canada under the EIPA?
I want to begin by saying it's irresponsible to suggest that these sanctions are not worth putting on Russia. This is an effort that as a country, we should be supporting Ukrainians in their time of need in terms of protecting their territorial integrity, their state sovereignty. And Mr. Chair, I'm actually surprised that the member
Having a
opposite
paper
Thank
tiger
you.
doesn't
We're
does
out
not
of time.
believe that as
I'm
well.
going to go next to MP Rob Oliphant. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to follow up on some earlier questions that I think were really fine from Mr. Abeltaif, who was digging into the necessity for this change. My understanding is that there was an interpretation of the existing laws that could have limited the government's ability to defend Canadian economic sovereignty, Canadian economic well-being, and so that these amendments were put in on both the export side and the import side to clarify for certainty to ensure that the government would be acting under the law while Canadians were concerned about their economic well-being by either economic dependency or on cheap goods coming into Canada from areas that would diminish jobs in Canada. Am I right on that this was to add a certain legal clarity so that the government could act under a government council?
Yes, exactly. And I will further emphasize that each country has its own unique control framework. And our view is that having a power that other countries have would enable us to collaborate with them internationally, as well as to provide us with yet another measure if, in fact, we did require to respond to issues relating to economic security. And I will also say that the amendments would be taken very seriously and would only be utilized in cases where there is no other tool to respond to the crisis at hand. It's an extra layer of security where other tools may not get the job done.
Thank you, Minister. And following up on other questions, we have three sanctions regimes, really, we work under with the Special Economic Measures Act, the so-called Magnitsky Law, as well as UN, participation in UN sanctions regime. That there are not prosecutions at times could suggest that the sanctions are working. It could suggest actually that the power of these sanctions is for importers and exporters of goods in Canada to follow the law. And that I would say that this measure that you're adding is signaling to industry and to other countries that might want to threaten Canada's economic prosperity that we have a law that is strong and it matches laws of some other countries quite similarly. Is this law unique to Canada, or is it part of a number of, is it similar to laws in other countries that would be deemed necessary to assert our economic sovereignty, as it were?
This is a moment in the history of our country where protecting Canadian sovereignty is of the utmost importance. And like other countries, Canada is taking measures to ensure that we're protecting our economic security and therefore our overall sovereignty. This is in addition to investments that we are making in the Canadian Armed Forces and in Arctic security, $80 billion for the defense and security of our country in the last federal budget, which I will note the members opposite voted against. It is important also, if I could, to finalize the answer that I provided in the last round of questioning, that there is proof that we are moving forward with the forfeiture of assets, including the Antonov aircraft. Forfeiture proceedings for the aircraft were initiated in 2025 by the Government of Canada in Ontario Superior Court. And this is yet another example of the way in which we are utilizing the laws for the benefit of the Ukrainian people. It's very important
and
for us
doing
to
that within
remember
the rule
that.
of law, doing it within the rule of law, which is quite critical. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, MP Oliphant, for concluding that round. Minister, I want to thank you for your appearance and testimony before this committee. We will now briefly suspend the meeting to prepare for the second portion of our meeting. Thank you. Before proceeding with the witnesses, I'd like to inform members that any proposals or amendments they wish to submit as part of the study of Bill C-15 must be forwarded to the committee clerk. The clerk will compile them and transmit them to the Standing Committee on Finance no later than February 27th. Members therefore have until February 26th to submit their proposals or amendments. In addition, the clerk circulated earlier today the budget for the present meeting. Is it the pleasure of the committee to adopt the budget? $500. Thank you. To start off the next, yeah, for the, that's right. Okay, excellent. I now welcome back Mr. Robert Brookfield, who was with us during the first hour. He's also joined by two colleagues, Patrick Boulanger, Director, Export Controls Policy Division, as well as Christian Larose, Acting Director, Export Controls Operation Division. Welcome. I will now open the floor to questions, beginning with Mr. Abul Taif. You have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks for the members for appearing before committee today. What is, or who would like to define the economic security interest?
I believe, as you've heard in the past from the Minister now today and from my colleagues in previously, the intent of the economic security terminology is broad. The gap that it is intended to fill is the difference that presently exists under the Export and Import Permits Act to allow listings for various purposes, such as fulfilling free trade agreements, defense materials, and distribution for national security, and the broader desire to respond to the changing world we live in, under which other economic security interests, such as supply chains and potential economic threats from other countries, are directed at us.
Thank you. Global Affair Canada officials have indicated that Clause 461 would allow articles to be added to the import control list, if necessary, to prevent Canada from developing an economic dependence on relatively cheap product or cheap goods from unreliable foreign supplier. So when we speak about cheap product, we know historically via globalization, China was on that list somehow of product that you could be buying. Is this still the case now? And will this application of 461 would manage to help preventing those incidents from happening?
I would say that both 460 and 461 are intended to give us a tool that could be used in appropriate circumstances. It's country agnostic in the sense that this amendment does not target any particular country or any particular product. It would allow the controls, whether that's simply monitoring or whether it's restrictions or whether it's prohibitions on listed products as they are described in appropriate circumstances.
Would you, if you're to think about this, would you think of any product or any country in specific that this could measure be used immediately as we are implementing it?
I certainly could think of many countries or products that it could theoretically be used against. I would say the intent of the legislation is not specifically to target any particular country or product, and the idea is to close a gap in terms of tools that could then be used, as the Minister said, after appropriate consultations and calculations as to the impacts of any particular product being added, and the types of controls that would be put. Simply putting a product on the list through regulations would be insufficient to really determine what the controls are. The question would be, what's the nature of the control? Again, is it prohibition or monitoring? Is it restriction on the volume? Other sorts of things.
I know the new regulation would apply to any product, to any country out there, but there must be priorities in which areas or which industries we target in order to be able to protect a Canadian product. Any policy, it means to do two things: one on the inside, one on the outside. So part of the process is to somehow also protect our industries and protect our consumers. So the question is, what I'm trying to get from you is there a specific top list of product and industries that we like to see protected?
A simple answer is no. There are various possibilities of how this tool could be used, but the motivation for this change is that the tool could be used in many situations, some which we can guess at now, some of which we can't even speculate at. The purpose of it is to allow us to be flexible moving forward.
So that means we will have new tools in the hand of the government to implement new measures. Is that correct?
Yeah, the purpose of the legislation would be to allow new items to be added to the export control list.
What are these new tools that they did not exist before?
Before, under the export control list or the import control list, there were only certain grounds under which an item could be added. That did not include the grounds of economic security. The legislation is changed regularly to adapt to changing situations. For example, about a decade ago, 3.1G was added to allow softwood lumber exports to be monitored because of the context of the relationship with the United States. It was deemed appropriate to be able to monitor those transactions, and they were not presently allowed under the legislation that then exists. So this would allow greater possibilities for adding items to the list.
The purpose of this legislation is to make a positive impact on the way we do things. Is that correct?
I believe so, yes.
Is there any negative side of that you'd anticipate that could happen? For example, negotiating a new trade agreements.
Well, the Export and Import Permits Act presently allows the implementation of trade agreements through it. It's regularly done, for example, to implement tariff rate quotas or other sorts of things under free trade agreements. This amendment is not necessary for us to implement free trade agreements. But if your question is, does adding items to the list and adding controls on an item potentially have positive and negative implications? Yes, for certainly. Any restriction on imports or exports, even the requirement to file a permit for statistical purposes, does put some burdens on industry that are affected. So part of any consideration for what's added on and what the control would be is the positive and negative impacts that would be.
Global Affairs, which is your department, used the word economic dependence. Does that mean that the government anticipate that we do have economic dependence?
It's not within the mandate of my unit to pronounce as to whether we have economic dependence from an economic perspective. I think that would probably be more for the Department of Finance or economists in our unit. I would say this tool is intended to potentially be used against economic dependence.
So what does the term mean then?
I don't think the term is used in the legislation amendments here. I don't have a view from my perspective.
I do have a note in front of me that suggests that the Global Affairs have indicated that Clause 461 would allow articles to be added to the import control list if necessary to prevent Canada from developing an economic dependence.
That's probably
from
true.
Foreign Affairs.
The general point I would say is that the language here in this legislation is intended to be broad. One of the potential ways it could be used is to combat economic dependence, however defined. There's no definition in the legislation on what that term means.
We are over time, so I'm going to go next to Anita Vandenbeld. You have 6 minutes.
And thank you very much for being here and answering some of the more technical aspects of this. And we know that Canada has one of the strongest export and import permits regimes in the world. Usually, the things that are put on the import or on the export control list have to do with national security or with international law, like the Arms Trade Treaty and others like that. Can you tell me, first of all, what normally, like, how strong is our import and export control system, and then what change would this be from maybe more national security to including economic coercion? Does that mean that we're seeing that as a national security threat? So what is actually changing in this?
So yes, we have a very strong and robust export and import controls regime. We have, under that regime, approximately 5,000 permits a year that are what we call strategic export and import permits. Those are dual use, military, nuclear, etc. We actually have, under our unit, administers many more exports and import permits which are more economic in nature, so implementing supply agreements and free trade agreements. So actually we issue about 280,000 permits a year, only 5,000 of which are strategic export permits. But most of those are automatic for dairy and sugar and things like that. That's the part that can implement free trade agreements and other economic agreements. What this provision would do was add perhaps what is arguably another category or an expansion of the category of strategic permits that would allow us to look to put products on the list that would not be in the course of free trade agreements or other sorts of economic situations, traditionally put, but they're more about supply chain dependence, potential economic dependence, or potentially to implement agreements with other countries to ensure that Canadian companies and Canadian industry and workers have access to the products they need at an appropriate price.
Can you walk us through what happens when an item is listed? What does that mean for the exporting company or the importing company? What is the process that then it needs to go through?
So if a product, let's just call it product X to be neutral, was added to the export control list, in order to export that product X, you would need to have a permit. We would then, as part of putting that item on the export control list, have to have in place a permitting regime. That permitting regime could be, as for example applies for many softwood lumber products, automatic. You simply need to go through the electronic system. If you apply, you will automatically get the permits, and we will be able to track as a statistical purpose what's being exported. Or it could be, as is the case right now, for example, for military goods, a very elaborated process where we look at each individual permit, we see whether it has potential human rights or humanitarian concerns, strategic value, we look at various considerations, including the nature of the product and the destination, and come to an individual decision as to, in furtherance to the minister's power, as to whether or not permit should be granted or denied.
And how much of this is permissive of the minister and how much is binding? Like, for instance, I know that items under the Arms Trade Treaty, it says that the minister must or shall not sign a permit, an export permit, if it could actually lead to some of the Section 7 violations, like, abuse of civilians and terrorism. So in this case, I would imagine that it is a little bit more permissive than that. It's really, there's more discretion there.
Courts have found in general, including for military items, that the Minister of Foreign Affairs under the Export and Import Permits Act has a broad discretion, but it's not unconstrained. And as you noted, specifically with respect to items covered by the Arms Trade Treaty, and in fact more broader than the treaty itself requires, but as Parliament chose to apply it more broadly to, for example, parts for military items, the requirement is to look at an item and to discern whether it meets certain problems, and if so, to deny the permit. But as a discretionary matter, even if that product is not subject to the Arms Trade Treaty, for example, a dual-use item that could be a nuclear pump, the minister can look at those, and does look, our department looks at those items to determine whether there is appropriate problems, and if so, then the permit is normally denied.
And how strong is our legislation compared to other countries?
I believe from talking to colleagues and from our review of other countries, it's one of the most robust and strongest in the world.
And we do also have follow-throughs. Like we have ways of ensuring that you don't have that when you are exporting, it doesn't then end up being sent. I'm thinking particularly the Arms Trade Treaty. We have a lot of robust assurances to make sure that there are not third parties that would be able to access those.
We have a continuum of measures to ensure that items or to to strive to ensure that items do not go where they should not go. I mean, starting with the companies themselves. And we deal with companies from coast to coast to coast. They don't want to break the law. They deal with us on a regular basis. They have their own permit officer. They sometimes make mistakes, or they might have someone internal. They have their own compliance programs. We start with that, and then it escalates to the point of potential internal administrative penalties, such as not getting permits if they don't do it appropriately, to the Canadian Border Services Agency imposing fines or freezing items, to RCMP imposing prosecutions.
In your view, this change to the legislation will strengthen it?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. The other two individuals, would you like to add anything? No? Okay. How much time do I have, Mr. Chair?
It's 15 seconds.
Oh, okay. Well, I just want to thank you then for the work and for your testimony today.
Okay, we go to MP Duceppe. You have 6 minutes.
Merci, mon président préféré.
Thank you. Thank you for being here today. I didn't have an answer to this earlier. What and in what way will the amendments we're discussing today strengthen Canada's ability to comply with its international human rights and humanitarian right obligations? Now, when there's an application for an export license, we do have questions on human rights and other international principles. They're taken into account when the decision to issue the permit or not to issue it is made. And if those criteria aren't met, you block imports. Where are those criteria? Some are in the statute, like for arms trafficking. Others are in policy and in international law. Do you know the U.S. legislation on importing products of forced labor into the U.S.? At present, Canadian legislation leaves it up to the customs officer to demonstrate that products coming into the country have not come from forced labor, whereas the U.S. legislation reverses the burden of proof. The importer has to show that forced labor was not involved in manufacture. That's far more efficient and robust as a statute, much more than these provisions. Would it not be easier to basically use the same provisions as the U.S. to make sure products don't come in through Canada to then be dumped in the U.S.? I do understand that this is a more of a policy question. There are a number of legislative tools in the Canadian arsenal to deal with foreign issues. The EIPA has some aspects of this, but there are others, like the Supply Chains Act and customs tariffs, which are not the result of policy. There was a ship that had been moored in Canada that was sent away, whereas millions of tons are blocked in the U.S. Have there been any consultations with the industries concerned before these provisions were formulated? We always work closely with all industries in Canada. With these provisions, we're not targeting a specific sector or country, and we're not at that stage yet. So before adding anything to the list, well, that's where we would need to have consultations with industries or companies or stakeholders. Yes, I understand. Would these provisions deal with loopholes that are allowing Canadians to work with problem actors around the world? It would be one tool to counter problems of that kind, yes, because if something is put on the list, it has to be linked to a sanctioner policy. We talked about the Magnitsky Act and the Special Measures Act. I'm sorry, I don't know the titles in French. I'd like to thank the witnesses. Chair, I have submitted a notice of motion. The motion is as follows. I believe that we already have the motion that pursuant to Standing Order 1081, the committee invite Mark Wiseman, Canada's new ambassador to the U.S., to appear for 2 hours to testify about his mandate in the context of the Canada-U.S. In the context of Canada-U.S. relations. I understand there was a notice of motion, and we knew this was coming. There is a subcommittee that will sit next week to talk about motions and upcoming business, future business. Perhaps it would be a better idea to discuss this more at length in the subcommittee. Would you like to wait for next week until the subcommittee meeting at which we'll be discussing the agenda, or do you want to deal with this today? Chair, if I may, I would like the motion to be passed, and I think I'm not alone in hoping that.
I would like to present a friendly amendment to the motion, if okay.
C'est quoi ton friendly amendment?
I know. Yeah, the amendment would be that pursuant to Standing Order 1081, the committee invite Mike Wiseman, Canada's new ambassador to the United States, to appear for 2 hours to testify about his mandate in the context of the Canada-U.S. relations after taking office.
Monsieur le Président, j'accepte.
Chair, I agree to the friendly amendment.
La répéter une autre fois.
Point of
Would you
order.
please repeat that again?
There is no such thing in our standing orders as a friendly amendment, so we would have to vote on the amendment as such, and it would be up to the prerogative of the committee to do that.
Sure.
My understanding from the clerk is that we take a vote on the amendment first and then on the motion, right? So, okay. All in...
Can you just reread the amendment? Because
yes, please.
I wasn't listening to the
Mr.
interpretation.
Abouteif,
Do you have both
could,
official languages or no? Okay, parfait, merci. Okay, just read it one more time.
Okay. Sure. The amendment said that pursuant to Standing Order 1081, the committee invite Mark Wiseman, Canada's new ambassador to the United States, to appear for 2 hours to testify about his mandate in the context of the Canada-U.S. relations after taking office.
Okay. I'd like us to proceed on voting on the amendment. All in favor?
I would just say that we're in favor of that, and I would want to just speak on the amendment for a moment, because I think it's very important to understand that under the Westminster parliamentary tradition, it is the executive's prerogative to appoint ambassadors. The Prime Minister will make that appointment, and that it is not the responsibility of this committee to do a confirmation hearing. We're not American. And so I would take great offense if we had a sense that this was some sort of an equivalent to an American confirmation hearing. Rather, we'll support this amendment because it clarifies that we are going to be discussing his mandate as has been given to him in the context of the state. So we are very supportive of the amendment. Thank you.
Okay, so I gather that there is unanimity in terms of supporting the amendment from all members. Okay, and
agreed.
And we shall then proceed to voting on the motion itself. All in favor? Yeah. Okay. None against. Okay. Thank you. We'll go next to the next round, beginning with MP Holman. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses before the committee. Gentlemen, Division 27 of Bill C-15 dramatically expands the definition of economic security under the Export and Import Permits Act, giving the Cabinet broad discretion to restrict imports and exports without clear limits. Can you explain why the government is asking Parliament to sign off on such sweeping powers without clearly defining what constitutes an economic security threat, and how Canadians can be assured this authority will not be abused to interfere with lawful trade and domestic industries?
Thank you for the question. First, a small quibble. I would argue it does not substantially expand the term economic security because that term does not exist presently under the Export Import Permits Act, but certainly it adds the terminology of allowing items to be added to the list for economic security purposes, and that is a potentially broad expansion as we've testified. The purpose is to allow the government to add to the export control list or import control list an item in a broad variety of potential situations. The reassurance in terms of potential abuse is the regulatory process. This would need to go through the normal regulatory process, which would require potential consultations and publications. It would be subject to, as all legislative and regulatory matters, review by the courts if there are abuses outside the discretion appropriate for the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and obviously for stakeholders and others to express concerns about the right balancing of items being added to the list and the controls that are added in relation to anything item added to the list.
Okay. Excuse me. Okay, thank you for the answer. Gentlemen, subsection 5.1 of the Act already allows the government to restrict imports of arms and ammunition, and Bill C-15 expands that power further under the banner of economic security. Why is the government pursuing yet another backhanded attack on lawful hunters, sport shooters, and farmers instead of focusing its efforts on stopping...
Point d'ordre, Monsieur le Président. Excusez-moi, est-ce que je me suis trompé de comité?
I'm sorry, speaking here.
Je pensais qu'on était sur le comité des affaires étrangères, Monsieur le Président.
I thought this was the Committee of Foreign Affairs.
Honourable member to complete his question with a reminder that if you could please stick to the Act and the amendments.
All right, I'll just continue with my question. My question, why is the government pursuing yet another backhanded attack on lawful hunters, sport shooters, and farmers instead of focusing on its efforts on stopping smuggled guns and cracking down on violent criminals who actually threaten public safety?
The Export and Import Permits Act already allows, under the existing legislation, firearms to be added under the export control list or the import control list. These amendments are not targeting that situation because it's not necessary. The goal of these amendments is to deal with economic security matters, which is precisely those kinds of areas not presently covered in terms of military or arms or weapons, including those used by hunters.
Thank you for the answer. Next question. Global affairs officials testified that these amendments do not immediately impose new controls, but merely give the government flexibility to act later. Gentlemen, may you please tell Canadians plainly whether there are already a list of goods, technologies, or industries the government intends to target once this authority is in place, or is Parliament being asked to approve a blank check with no transparency?
I won't accept the premise of the question, but I will say there is no list of items intended to be targeted today.
Okay, thank you for answering the question. If there is no agenda, no predetermined reason for this policy, then why is the government seeking more powers?
To restate what Minister Anand said, and I believe I've said as well, the purpose is that we have identified a gap in the existing legislation in the sense that we do not presently have the authority to add items to the export control list or the import control list in situations where Canada is being economically damaged or potentially economically at risk, as opposed to the existing provisions which relate primarily to trade agreements or to situations of military defense.
Again, thank you for answering that question. Continuing, gentlemen, officials acknowledge that import controls could be used to prevent reliance on cheap goods from unreliable foreign suppliers. At a time when Canadians are struggling with affordability, how does the government justify policies that could deliberately restrict lower-cost imports, drive up prices, and worsen the cost of living crisis for families?
I would suggest that if these amendments were passed, any decision to add an item to the list on that basis would need to take into account the considerations that you have raised, as well as the potential benefits of adding a particular item to the list and the controls that would go with it.
Again, thank you for answering my questions. One more. These amendments concentrate significant economic and trade power in cabinet with decisions triggered by regulation rather than legislation. Given this government's track record of overreach and pure consultation, why should Canadians trust the Liberals to wield new powers responsibly instead of using them to pick winners and losers or punish sectors that are politically opposed?
I think as a nonpartisan public servant, I'm not in a position to answer that question.
Okay. Time?
2 seconds.
I yield my time. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you so much, Mr. Holman. We next go to MP Guilbeault. You have 5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, messieurs, d'être ici.
Thank you for being here, gentlemen. Earlier today, the minister referred to the fact that a number of countries had similar measures, instituted similar measures. She indicated that Japan, Germany, and the U.S. all had. Could you give us some examples of the parallels? What measures have those countries put in place compared to what we're trying to do here today? I have no details. What we can do is provide the committee with them. But broadly speaking, our analysis shows that, well, we can look at the states. The U.S. has a great many tools. We don't. The European Union, Germany and Japan and countries like Australia have their own legislation. Of course, that's based on their own system. The EU is very complicated. But I can say that in our study, we saw that all those countries have the powers to put in place measures to deal with making production and supply chains more reliable and more resilient to economic threats. Generally speaking, it is on the basis of that analysis that we propose the measures before you. We can provide the committee with more details. Thank you. I know that you said there was no list of products or list of targeted countries. Can you give us some idea of the kind of trade that could be affected by measures like these? As a purely hypothetical example, if a Canadian product was limited internationally and we wanted to make sure it would be exported only to certain countries or to be distributed so it didn't all go to one country, we could then, with these powers, limit the amounts going to certain countries with criteria. Thank you, Chair. I have no other questions. Thank you.
Okay. Monsieur Duceppe, you have 2.5 minutes. Yep.
Mr. Duceppe, 2.5 minutes. Will there be a transition period for importers and exporters to adjust? Will there be guidelines to make sure there are no involuntary interruptions to trade? Every time or any time that something would be added to a list, we would be dealing with a company. There is a guide to export controls on our website to assist companies and individuals. In Christian's unit, we deal with countries and firms individually. So if we decide to list a certain product, we'll be dealing with a company that makes it. A recent example, on the control list, we added quantum computing, and we dealt with the quantum computing industry to warn them, to make sure that they understood the situation and what was happening. So what about the transition period? You said there are clear directives and you make sure that there's no confusion and that everything is well understood. I can add that the process of adding something to the list and the consultations associated with it could go through an implementation period, it would be regulated. Thank you.
We go next to MP Mantle. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. I believe I heard in your testimony that your view was that Canada has one of the most robust and strongest sanctions and export control regimes in the world. I was surprised by that. As you'll probably be aware, there was a report released from March 2025 that said actually the exact opposite of that, that Global Affairs lacked a regulatory culture and was ill-equipped to enforce our regime. Are you taking issue with that internal report? It was prepared by Global Affairs for internal consumption. Do you disagree with that report?
First of all, I'll say my comment was about our export control regime. We do, I would argue, have a robust sanctions regime as well, but since the topic here is that changes to the Export and Import Permits Act, my commentary is focusing on that element. I reiterate, yes, I believe we do have a robust export controls regime and import controls regime. Could we do better? Certainly. There are reports from this committee, there are reports from the Senate, there is an internal report, all indicating ways in which we could do better. One recent example is this committee in January of last year, or 2024, pardon me, recommended that sanctions and export controls be looked at as a potential merger for potentially finding synergies. That is being in progress. I'm presently responsible for the Sanctions Bureau and separately the Export Controls Bureau. They will be merged this summer. So we are certainly always trying to improve. I would say we have the strongest and one of the strongest and most robust export controls regime in the world. That doesn't mean we can't do better. I would also argue that other countries have their own problems, and not for me to comment on them, but we look to them and to try and take the lessons of what's better from them and areas where we can improve.
I mean, of course, you would agree that many of our sanctions-related measures are implemented under the EIPA. For example, prohibitions on exporting certain goods to unfriendly nations like Russia, or prohibitions on importing goods like crude oil from Russia. How would you measure your success then? What are your KPIs? How should we measure whether what you're saying about the regime is true? You say it's the best, the most robust. How should we measure that?
First, to clarify a point, the Export and Import Permits Act is not our primary legislation for dealing with sanctions against Russia. That's primarily the Special Economic Measures Act, which has prohibitions on exportation and other dealings prohibitions. So it is a different regulatory regime. It's true that under the Export and Import Permits Act, we do have a policy of presumptive denial for controlled goods to Russia, but they are not, for example, on the area control list, which is another sanctions-like mechanism under the Export and Import Permits Act. So to clarify that point, that's not legislation before this committee, as I understand it. But I'm sorry, I think I missed the second part of your question.
Your KPIs for the...
So under the Export and Permits Act, one of our primary KPIs is a question of service standards. We provide a report to Parliament every May on exports pursuant to required under Section 27 of the Export and Import Permits Act, which are goods under Group 2, military goods essentially. That sets out the extent to which we are meeting our service standards. Our service standards is essentially that we will provide a decision on a permit within 10 days of application to NATO plus countries, Japan and South Korea, and for 40 days for other countries.
Do any of your KPIs refer to referral to RCMP for potential violations?
I'm a bit confused by the question. Our desire and our system is structured to prevent violations. As I mentioned earlier, most Canadian companies and most individuals in Canada,
point, Mr.
if I may finish, want to comply with the law. Our focus is on helping them to comply with the law. Yeah. We would not want to have a system where our status of our system is measured by how many people violate it. We want to prevent them from violating, and most of them don't want to violate it.
And I would suggest to you that violations are rampant and well documented. For example, the export of Canadian-made electronic detonators to Kyrgyzstan, which were re-exported to Russia. The export of Canadian luxury jets to Russia, over 30 since the war began. So I don't think it's reasonable or persuasive to suggest that because we have this regime, everybody follows it. I think actually Canada has a reputation for being a paper tiger. And when I taught a course at Queen's Law on this, that was one of my exam questions. So in the last 30 seconds, I'll give you the exam question, and give me your answer, because our question was to the students, do you think Canada's export and import controls and sanctions are a paper tiger?
Point of order, Chair.
And then
I'm not aware of the specific examples you gave. I will say as a general point, we look into very carefully any allegations of problems, and we do try and make sure that they are prosecuted and addressed. There are challenges from prosecutions. At the end of the day, it's for independent police to do the best they can with the evidence they have to bring a case that could be prosecuted to prosecutors, which meets the criminal standard in order to be able to bring a challenge. That's not our department's responsibility, but we do support them in doing so.
Thank you very much. Next, we go to MP Rob Oliphant. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you. I won't need all that. Thank you. I think the officials have done a very good job at explaining the regimes to us. I just want to take a moment to thank you for your work that you do. The number of sanctions which have been imposed, really beginning with Venezuela as the first surge of sanctions, then with Russia, we have broken all records in the amount of work that you have had to do. I also want to thank you because it has proven to be an incredible incentive for Canadian businesses to comply. You get many responses, many questions, I am sure, from exporters who would like to sell something, but check it out first, and then they are in compliance with the law. And I am assuming that is far more of your work than is acknowledged publicly. So thank you for your work, and we'll see what comes in the next round of legislative changes that could happen in the future. So thank you very much.
Would you like to respond to any of those comments?
Thank you for your kind words.
Okay. Thank you very much to the officials for your patience and your testimony in front of this committee. And I want to thank you for being here today. That brings us, colleagues, to the end of the meeting. Is it the will of the committee to adjourn the meeting? Yeah. Thank you. Merci. Adjourned.